battles that took place on the Russian front during World War II were amongst the most ferocious and destructive engagements ever fought. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia pitched themselves against each other in an ideological war that would see millions of soldiers and civilians die in the quest for dominance. One of these titanic battles took place in the little-known town of Kursk, situated near Kharkov. In the Great Offensive, which was given the German codename of Citadel, the might of Hitler's new generation of panzers was thrown against the tide of Russian tanks. The outcome of this battle would be instrumental in deciding the outcome of the war. It was high noon on the Eastern Front.
The whole Russian campaign can be seen with two highlights. First, Stalingrad. The German expansion, military expansion, ended in Stalingrad. We never could advance in any significant way after that. But the real crunch, of course, was Kursk. Even Hitler knew that, of course, because he was no fool, whatever else he was. And he himself hesitated long enough to start the Battle of Kursk, you see. But he always, you see, it is a risk, but what a prize in front of us. Because in the salient of Kursk, 40% of the whole Russian field army was concentrated, plus a major part of the enormous tank force. Against that, Germany had to go to war and try to break through. And of course, they lost, as we all know, in the end, and that meant the war as such couldn't be won anymore.
Hitler intended that Operation Citadel, the great attack on the Kursk salient in 1943, would be the decisive blow. He'd argued in 1941 that the Red Army was destroyed, which it wasn't. He argued again in 1942 that the Red Army was destroyed, which it wasn't, by the way. Here in 1943, Hitler was determined to deliver the coup de grace. This is what it was to be, the largest armored operations in world history. A gigantic assembly of tanks and guns and aircraft, assault troops. And Hitler had placed enormous hopes upon it. It was, I think, meant to be a war-winning blow. It was meant to correct, if you like, the lingering impression of Stalingrad. It's to wipe that out. It was to afford the Germans something which was extremely important, which is to say it was intended to ensure that the German army retained the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. This, under no circumstances, must pass to the Russians. From that point of view, then, Operation Citadel was of crucial importance.
In the wake of the German disaster at Stalingrad in February 1943, the Red Army continued its lightning advance. Finally, the 1st SS Panzer Corps, who were part of Army Group South, managed to halt the Soviet thrust around Kharkov in March 1943. To the north, the hard-pushed Army Group Center had also managed to stall the Russian advance around the region of Orel. Together, these two German army groups were just about managing to hold the Russian attacks. However, between their positions was a huge Russian bulge, or salient.
The Kursk salient in 1943, really, in terms of extent, it was rather like taking a sizable slice of Wales, which is considerable area, by the way. And it really was configured, as all salients are. It was a large arrow, really, sticking right into the German center. You had the northern face and the southern face, and across it you had the town of Kursk, of course, at the center of this. And the Russians, the Soviet command, for the first time decided to fight a major, sustained, deliberate defensive battle.
Hitler ordered that this salient was to be cut off and the Soviet forces inside destroyed. The plan itself was simple. It called for the inspirational handling of armored forces. The men of the German Tank Corps felt they were equal to the task. The 9th Army would attack from Orel in the north. The 4th Panzer Army would attack from Belgorod in the south. These two great advances would meet in the middle and trap the Russians inside a huge pocket. They could then concentrate on the destruction of these trapped forces. The architect of this great scheme was Field Marshal von Manstein, who was an experienced veteran with a good understanding of armor in battle.
Manstein was the best field marshal Germany ever had. And of course, as such, he commanded the Southern Front, Heeresgruppe Süd, in the Russian campaign. And he most definitely was the man to choose, because he was one man. With the right forces, he could attack and win a war. But he was dead against the postponement, which constantly took place. Manstein and his troops captured Charkov shortly before the Battle of Kursk, well, a few months before, and the Russians more or less were beaten on that occasion. And Manstein was all for it, to attack straight away the salient of Kursk and, if possible, capture it. He wanted more tanks, more guns, more everything. And of course, the Russians themselves built up their forces. They hadn't got to bring their guns right from Berlin or from West Germany. They had it all there, you see. It took them much quicker, and their build-up was much worse.
The Russian forces facing the Citadel offensive were aware that their forces were vulnerable in this area. Both sides could see that this area could represent the decisive battle of the campaign so far. Germany was keen to regain the initiative in Russia after the Stalingrad debacle. The recent success at Kharkov had provided an important but small taste of what could be achieved. Nonetheless, Hitler did have misgivings about this offensive, and he even confessed to Guderian that the thought of it made his stomach turn over. To the troops, however, he stressed the importance of this forthcoming battle. He boasted that the coming victory at Kursk will be a beacon for the whole world. It was a measure of his anxiety that the out-of-favor General Heinz Guderian was recalled to oversee the preparation of the new armored forces for the battle.
This is the Panzer Mark III. A tank like this was adequate for the battles that were being fought in the Western Desert, where it was meeting British armour, which by that stage was frequently inferior. But in Russia, where the T-34 really was king, this machine was no longer up to the task of being a main battle tank. There'd been a number of innovations which had kept the Panzer III fighting right into 1943. Chief among them is the up-armouring. This is the Ausführung L, the L version, with the long-barreled 50mm gun here. And what this gun did was it gave it extra velocity and the kind of punch that was just about sufficient to deal with a T-34 at reasonably close range, provided you could attack it from the side or the rear. And what kept the Panzer III fighting was its superior training of the crews, and also the fact that these vehicles all had radios and were able to communicate with each other in a far better way than the T-34 initially could. When it first came onto the battlefield, the Russians were still using signal flags to communicate between the vehicles, so although it was a far better machine, these tanks could communicate with each other and outthink and outfight the T-34 in that respect. By the time of the Battle of Kursk, the Russian crews are much more experienced, and they're also getting over the disadvantages of not having radios. The tanks are beginning to increasingly be radio equipped, and really this machine is no longer considered a main battle tank. However, for the Germans, there was absolutely no alternative. These machines had to be pressed into service, and they paid the price at Kursk. A large number were destroyed, and that was despite all of the efforts they'd made to try and up-armour and upgrade the machine. This particular version, the Ausführung L, has had spaced armour added to the front of the vehicle, which was intended to dissipate the power of a shot striking the vehicle here and to protect the tank in that way. It was done in the factory, and it was really an attempt to try and prolong the fighting life of these tanks, but by 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, really they had come to the end of their useful life.
For the coming offensive at Kursk, Hitler knew that he was approaching his last opportunity to win a decisive victory in the east. For that reason, he ordered the deployment of some of the latest designs in German tanks, even though some of them had not been properly tested and teething problems were still very much in existence. One vehicle with more than its fair share of teething problems was the new Panzer Mark V, better known as the Panther.
In September 1941, the German panzer forces met a large concentration of T-34s outside Minsk. And during the battle, the T-34 demonstrated its superiority to such an extent that the Germans decided they'd have to build their own copy of the T-34 for various reasons, both practical and for propaganda reasons. They couldn't copy a Russian design, and so they designed their own vehicle, which eventually became the Panther tank. It incorporated most of the ideas of the T-34, sloped armour, large road wheels, wide tracks, and it was equipped with a new 75mm gun, which was as powerful, if not more powerful, than the 88 carried by the Elephant and by the Tiger. So for the Battle of Kursk, Hitler decided that he would use his three new heavy tanks, his Tiger, his Panther, and the Elephant, to overcome the Russian defences.
The similarity between the Panther and the T-34 is something that has been pointed to historically for years. It's different in a number of ways. Firstly, you would have to say that the standard of workmanship in the German factories far exceeded that in the Russian factories. So it's a much better engineered piece of machinery for a start. The quality is there, which you won't get in a Russian tank. But against quality is the time it takes to build it, so you probably get two T-34s for one of these. Its gun is better. The 75mm high-velocity gun, certainly compared with the 76 in the early T-34s, is a vastly better weapon. But then don't forget the T-34 up guns to 85mm in the later stages of the war and is back on a par again. If you look at the overall picture, and I think this is where the Russians got things right, the vast number of less suitable tanks usually has the edge over the really classy ones. And it would be true particularly of the Panther. The Panther enters production towards the end of the war, a time when German industry is under pressure but still trying to maintain its standards. It's very expensive in raw materials. It's a beautiful tank, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's putting so much pressure on the German manufacturing side that the quality begins to drop off.
Although the origins of this tank went back to 1937, little had been done to further the design, as the Germans were confident that their existing tank fleet was more than capable of meeting the enemy on any battlefield. The resulting design produced a tank in the 45-ton class, which was still classed as a medium tank by the Germans. The Panther was manned by a crew of 5 men. The main gun fitted was the excellent 75mm L-70 cannon, backed up with 2 machine guns. The armor protection was very adequate, 120mm thick, and was of the sloped design like the T-34. This gave even better protection to the already thick armor. The speed achieved by this vehicle was 30 miles an hour.
The tank was found to be underpowered and overweight, but nevertheless Hitler insisted that the pre-production prototypes be increased in number from 2 to 20, and then production was authorized. Unfortunately, because of the rush to produce the tanks and the problems with the tank were never corrected.
The first model was rushed through production and sent into battle at Kursk. The result was a distressingly high rate of breakdowns. In time, as later models were modified, the tank became a very reliable and much feared weapon.
There were about 200 new Panzers in this battle, all of them just coming off the production line with all their teething troubles. The crews not used to their tanks, and the result was catastrophic. Of the 200 on the first day who went into battle, I think 60 broke down on the way to the battle line, overheating mainly and flying on fire. And then the next lot, what was left of them, they went straight off after the attack started into a minefield which the Germans hadn't recognized and hence not cleared. So the whole tank force went in and the tanks blew up left, right and center again. And that was it. So a very, very poor debut for the Panzer. But it must be said, by the end of the war, it was just about the best medium tank the world had ever seen.
The Panzer Mark VI, or Tiger I, also had its origins in the pre-war years. Hitler ordered the design of a heavy tank that would not only overcome the threat of the T-34, but capture the lead for the Germans in tank design. The design produced a 55-ton tank that was also manned by 5 crew members. The crew of a Tiger consisted of the commander, who was in charge of the vehicle and selected targets. He also fired the turret machine gun. Next came the gunner, who sat next to the commander and targeted his enemies through his gun sights. In many respects, he was the most vital member of the crew. In battle, every shot had to count. The flight of a shell is affected by many factors, including wind direction, rain, snow, and other atmospheric conditions. The gunner had to gauge the range to the target, allow for any climatic factors, and compensate for the speed of any moving targets which were more difficult to hit. One miss could allow an enemy tank to get in the first vital shot, which spelled death in the tense tank duels of World War II. Positioned on the opposite side of the turret from the gunner was the loader. He did the heavy manual work of loading the gun. After each engagement, he also had the laborious job of emptying the shell cases and restocking the tank with the cumbersome rounds for the main gun. Inside the hull, towards the front of the vehicle, sat the driver. On his right was the radio operator, who fulfilled the vital communications function. He also manned the hull machine gun. The main gun was the 88mm L56 gun that first saw use as an anti-aircraft weapon. This gun was extremely potent and was capable of defeating any tank that it came up against, and often at ranges of up to 2,000 meters. The main armament was backed up with 2 machine guns.
This is the bow machine gun. It was operated by the radio operator, who was down here in the hull. So in addition to his communication jobs, he had to man a machine gun. Now, machine guns are notorious for jamming, so it wasn't a simple task. It had to be reloaded by one man, all jams had to be cleared, and at the same time, he was trying to stay in communication with all the other tanks in the battalion and relay messages to his commander and take messages from his commander and pass them on.
The huge weight of the Tiger and its rushed development both posed problems for its crews.
This is the driver's viewing slit. As you can see, it's not particularly a big area, but for an armoured vehicle there is a real danger that a shell could come flying in here. So in action, this metal visor was lowered and the driver had to rely on a periscope which exited from these 2 little visors in the front of the tank. One of the good features of the Tiger were these wide tracks. Now, it had those for 2 reasons. First of all, the vehicle was so heavy at 56 tons that you need something to spread the weight and lower the surface area. But in addition, in combat over mud and snow, the kind of conditions you would expect to find in Russia, these gave the tank much more mobility than any of the previous German models. As you can see, this is not something that's going to be easy to change. So if for any reason the tank loses a track, it was the devil's own job for the crew to be able to put the tracks back together again. And really, they more often than not had to rely on either other tanks to come along and help with that procedure, or hope that they could be dragged off the battlefield and repaired behind the lines. If they had to attempt to change them, they weigh a ton, they're difficult to change, and it was certainly a task that the crew wouldn't relish in any shape or form.
The Tiger first saw action at Leningrad in 1942. The results were poor, due to inadequate infantry protection and poor deployment. The Russians were able to knock the tanks out by aiming at the tracks. The Germans quickly learned their lesson, and future use of the Tiger I was carefully managed. The first large employment of the tank was at Kursk, when approximately 100 were used. Almost half of these were issued to the elite formations of the Waffen-SS and the Großdeutschland division. The Tiger I quickly earned a fearsome reputation against all of its foes. The tank only saw action for 2 years, but its reputation still stands today. The Tiger may have proved itself to be a good design, but the first tank destroyer which was based on the Tiger was a misguided failure. This heavy tank destroyer first saw life as designer Friedrich Porsche's version of the Tiger. Porsche was so confident that his design would be chosen that he proceeded with the manufacture of the vehicle despite the fact that a design by the rival Henschel company was also being considered. When Hitler chose Henschel's design in preference to Porsche's, 90 Porsche chassis had already been built, along with 50 turrets. Fortunately for Porsche, Hitler had also ordered the design of an assault gun that could mount the longer, high-velocity 88mm gun. The Tiger was found to be incapable of doing this, so the Porsche chassis was utilized as the basis of this new vehicle. The Elephant was born.
Well, there was a force of 90 elephants involved in the Battle of Kursk, which was almost the whole elephants in existence. After all, they were only a construction by Professor Dr. Porsche, which in the end wasn't used. But since they were half finished, it was decided to put heavy anti-tank guns on top of them, close them in, so the protection for the crew, and send them as they were, hardly tried, old story, back into the Battle of Kursk. They were 72 tons in weight, and they had 2 Maybach engines. They had no means of defending themselves against infantry attacks. And the Russians soon got used to that. You see, they let the tanks go through, came out of their foxholes and just jumped onto the tanks and knocked them out. In the first place, of course, the design was very weak in the running gear, and quite a few, just like with the Panther, quite a few broke down during the march itself because the running gear gave way.
These flaws helped to ensure that this new weapon was a failure at Kursk.
This is one of the successful attempts to deal with the T-34 menace. This is a Sturmgeschütz, which has had its main armament upgraded from a short 75mm gun to this long anti-tank weapon that we see here. Now, this was more than adequate to deal with the T-34 on fairly equal terms. And one of the chief advantages of the Sturmgeschütz is that by dispensing with the turret, they were much more easy to manufacture. You could make a lot more of these, probably 3 of these for every 2 tanks. And that was important because on the Russian front, quantity counted. There were something like 10,000 of these vehicles that were manufactured by the German forces in World War II. And it really did go a long way towards redressing the balance between the T-34 and the early German machines. There were a number of disadvantages, however, to employing a vehicle like this, particularly when it came to aiming the gun. There was very little play, and really you had to swing the whole vehicle to aim the main armament. But with the exception of the big battle at Kursk, really from 1942 onwards, the Germans are fighting a defensive war. And in that respect, these vehicles were excellent. They were fairly low, they could be easily camouflaged, and they packed a lot of punch with the 75mm gun, and you could get them onto the battlefield and make them available, and that's what Germany needed more than anything else.
Although the orders for the preparation of this attack were issued in April, The actual attack did not take place until 3 months later, in July. Delays had been ordered for a number of reasons. Hitler wanted no room for failure, so the plans were revised again and again to ensure no detail had been left out. In addition, the Führer had an almost childlike faith in the power of new weapons. He believed that the new generation of panzers would win the war, and he wanted the new Panthers and Elephants to be used in the battle. Despite the fact that the field trials of these new panzers were not complete, they were committed to the battle anyway. This decision would prove costly during the ensuing clashes. These delays caused further, unforeseen problems. The Russians had been made aware of the German plans through the help of the Lucy spy ring that had been passing decoded ultra messages from Bletchley Park in England. They could also observe the massive German preparations for the battle, and they began to make plans to meet the threat.
It has always been said, and it is beyond doubt, even the Russians admit this today, that the Russians knew the day of the attack, they knew where the Germans were going to attack, and they knew in which strength they are going to attack. Although the greatest secrecy was exercised on the German side, the Russians were informed. Well, it seems to be assumed that a certain spy ring in Switzerland, a fellow by the name of Rössler was in charge of that, a Swiss citizen, who had his agents even as close as Hitler's headquarters, who informed him of everything else. This fellow Rössler was working for the Russians, and since he was recruited by the Russians to work for them in Lucerne, in Switzerland, the whole spy ring and his proper code name was Lucy. But there is still a great doubt whether he was alone or even entirely responsible for the betrayal of all these data to the Russians. It is assumed that the Russians had yet another spy in Hitler's headquarters who went under the deck name of Werther. He hasn't been discovered to this day. Nobody knows, at least openly, who he was. And although the Germans knew quite well there was a spy within the headquarters, they never found out who it was.
Initially, Stalin had ordered an offensive to be launched. His generals, however, had persuaded him to adopt a defensive stance instead. The idea was to draw the German forces into a well-prepared trap and destroy them. When they were on the point of destruction, a heavy armored counterattack would be launched to finish them off. The Russians knew that the Germans would be concentrating large amounts of armor in the area, so particular attention was paid to anti-tank defenses. Anti-tank guns and anti-tank mines were laid out in pre-prepared areas that would blunt the German armor trying to punch through. The Russian defenses overall consisted of extensive lines of trenches, minefields, and pre-prepared killing grounds. These were arranged one behind the other and presented a formidable obstacle.
You've got on the central front, which was crucial, of course, something like 5,000 kilometers of trenches. 400,000 mines were laid. These were obviously designed to break up tank movements. The general Soviet system was this. They had really 3 lines of defenses. There was the first line, of course, which was really to break up the German attack. The second line, which hopefully would in fact enable them to bring their anti-tank defenses to bear. And the last line, of course, was really this was where the battle or the engagements would be conducted, and you would break up, defuse, and generally deflect the German attack as such. And this went all the way down from corps level, indeed from army down to corps, down to division, down to regiment, to battalion. Each had its own defensive sectors. For example, a corps defensive sector would run for about 20 kilometers. Behind this, deeply echeloned, were strong points, cross-connected, cross-communicated, with covering mines, obstacles, anti-tank guns, and of course the other most important element in the Russian defensive system was the artillery. So it really was a colossal undertaking.
Over 20,000 artillery pieces were moved into this area by the Soviets, together with over 3,000 tanks, 2,000 planes, and over 1 million men. The Russians had General Vatutin's Voronezh front and General Rokossovsky's Central Front in the salient. In reserve would be General Konev's Steppe Front. The brilliant tactician Marshal Zhukov was in overall command. One mistake that the Russians made was in the assessment of where the main German attack would fall. They believed that it would come from the north, and they arranged their forces accordingly. This resulted in a very tough defensive wall that would meet Model's forces head-on. However, the Germans had assembled their main attacking forces in the south, as part of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. This would cause the Russians a few worrying moments in the days ahead. The opening stages of the battle began just before 5 a.m. on the morning of the 5th of July, 1943. Through intelligence sources, the Russians knew when the Germans were going to launch the attack. In a well-planned move, Zhukov ordered the Soviets to launch a preemptive artillery barrage. This strike had the desired result of catching the Germans out in the open during the forming up stage. The ensuing panic and destruction offered a taste of what was to come. To add to the carnage, the Germans now launched their artillery strike. The resulting noise and destruction must have presented a devastating and possibly awe-inspiring sight. Although lasting less than 1 hour in total, this opening phase reached new heights of ferocity. The Russian artillery bombardment delayed the start of the German attack. It did get underway about 2 hours late, with the infantry leading the way.
Naturally, with so much at stake, Hitler used the best troops he had. As for the tanks, of course, he used nearly all of them he had, so there's not much to report about them. On the other hand, infantry divisions and such like, there's to mention Großdeutschland, one of the really top army divisions. By that time, I believe it was already an army corps. And on the other hand, the SS Panzer Corps. Again, the 3 SS divisions, Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Leibstandarte itself. And from all these old, well-tried divisions from all over the Eastern Front were drawn. They all had to give up troops, usually the best ones, as mentioned, to stiffen the whole attack as much as possible, rather than use a lot of untrained troops.
The 9th Army in the north under Field Marshal Model had 4 panzer divisions to call on: the 2nd, 9th, 18th, and the 20th, plus 3 heavy tank battalions. The heavy tank battalions consisted of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion, equipped with 30 Tiger, and the 653rd and 654th Heavy Tank Battalions, equipped with a total of 90 of the new Ferdinand Heavy Tank Destroyer. The emphasis of the German attack lay in the south, with General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf. There were a total of 9 infantry divisions in this area, together with the Großdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division and the SS Panzer Divisions Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. The SS divisions each had a company of 15 Tigers. The Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions were also equipped with the new Panthers. The Krak Großdeutschland division was also equipped with a Tiger company and a number of Panthers. To back this up, the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion was also allocated to this section, with a further 45 Tigers. This made for a very impressive lineup, and represented the best that Germany had to offer at the time, both in men and machines. One important area that the Germans lacked in was a suitable reserve force. The Russians had a very sizable reserve to call upon, but the Germans had been badly mauled by 2 years of fighting in Russia and had assembled everything they could spare for a last great throw of the dice. It was not just on the ground that new German weapons were being tested. Hans Ulrich Rudel, the famous Stuka pilot, was responsible for battle testing a new addition to the Stuka that would prove itself a menace for the Red Army tank men. A 37mm flak cannon was fitted to the underside of the plane. it was found that this weapon was very accurate and very effective at destroying enemy tanks. To make this new weapon work, however, the pilot had to go into a shallow dive and get within close range of his target, a task that presented its own dangers. The number of Russian tanks that fell to this new weapon grew steadily throughout the offensive. As the offensive began to gather momentum, the 9th Army began their advance along the main Orel to Kursk railway line. They quickly ran into the first defensive line, and the number of casualties began to rise. Within the first 2 days, the 9th Army's attack was halted near Olkavatka. They had advanced only 12 miles from their start point, but the concentration of the Russian forces in this sector had proved fatal for Model's forces. The revitalized Russian Air Force also helped to defeat the advance.
The Germans had established, once they made up their mind to attack, 16 airfields in the area of Kharkov, which is nearby there. And only on the day before did all the bombers to take part in the battle arrive on these airfields. Nobody knew beforehand what was planned or what was going on. So every of these 16 airfields was packed one day before with German fighter planes and of course the bombers. The next morning, on the morning of the attack, the Russians, about 2 in the morning, it gets about light by 2, 3 o'clock in the morning at the time of the year in Russia, the Russian Air Force approached en masse in hundreds and hundreds of planes, making straight for these German airfields. They were spotted in the last minute, and the report was sent back to these 16 airfields what was happening, imminent attack by Russian bombers. But the airfields themselves had discovered them with long-range radar, which the Russians obviously didn't know the Germans possessed there. So the Germans fighters took off straight away, and the bombers as well, and about 5 minutes flight time away from the airfields, the Russians were engaged. They had their own fighter screen, of course, their Yaks and Laks, and even a lot of American fighters, Air Cobras, supplied to them. And a tremendous battle developed, and on that one day the Russians alone lost about 430 aeroplanes there, and on the following day another 250. So honestly I don't know how much the Germans lost at the same time, but it was really a blow to them. On the other hand, the Russian Air Force wasn't as much needed as the German was, because the Russians themselves had massed behind their front enormous amounts of heavy and long-range artillery, which done the same job with less trouble. The Germans themselves, of course, started their tank-busting business there with Stuka dive bombers, which had 37mm guns mounted under them, which attacked the T-34s at the back, and I think one man alone, Colonel Rode, knocked out 36 alone during the years of the campaign. But the Russian Air Force was involved as well, but not from a great point as it might have been.
To compound the problems, the new German tanks that had expected to yield excellent results had performed miserably in battle. The Elephants did start well and had advanced a few miles into enemy territory. Initially, the thick frontal armor proved a good defense against enemy attempts to disable them. They could completely neutralize the enemy infantry positions. Accurate, sustained fire from the Soviet position prevented the German infantry from following behind them. The Ferdinands ran into difficulties when they became separated from their infantry support. The failure to fit an onboard machine gun prevented them from defending themselves against the enemy infantry. The same problems encountered by the Elephant were also seen in the Panther. Many of these tanks broke down on their way to the start point. Another worrying problem for the Panther crews was the fact that many of them caught fire. This was due to a badly designed exhaust system that accumulated unburned fuel that then caught fire. The first model of the Panther earned the nickname of Guderian's problem child. Around 200 of these tanks were sent to the Kursk area. Most broke down. The Tigers, too, experienced problems, especially with the retrieval of vehicles which were damaged by the extensive Russian minefields, which had been insufficiently cleared. A basic oversight which sent Guderian apoplectic with rage. In the south, Hoth's forces got off to a better start. The Tigers were placed at the head of the advance, with the Panthers providing flank cover. The weaker Panzer IIIs and IVs came in behind in what was known as a Panzerkeil, or armored wedge. The Russians had spread out their forces in the south. This helped the 4th Panzer Army to make relatively good progress. By the end of day 1, the 4th Panzer Army had advanced 15 miles to the town of Pokrovka. The advance slowed considerably after this, as the Russians poured waves of reserves into this area to meet the threat. As the advance slowed, the emphasis of the attack was shifted northwards. The SS divisions had reached and forced a crossing of the Svel River by the 11th of July, bringing them close to the town of Prokhorovka. They prepared to advance further, as Army Detachment Kempf followed behind, about 12 miles from their position.
They had two armies attacking, one from the north, which was the 9th Army, and one from the south, under Manstein and Hoos, which was the 4th Panzer Army. And they were supposed to meet roughly in the middle at a town called Oboyan. But as again mentioned earlier on, the Russians knew exactly where the Germans were going to attack, and they could make their own picture as to where they were going to meet. So the town of Oboyan was enormously fortified all around, not just at the town. The Russian defenses themselves were not just a few hundred yards apart from the Germans. The whole defense line stretched from at least 8 up to 12 miles, one defense line after another, fields of it. And the Germans never really managed to have an impression under the town of Oboyan. They did not meet, especially since the northern attack formation didn't get anywhere near it at that time. The southern group, hence, had to turn away and turn towards the town Prokhorovka. However, as they made their march toward that, they were informed that a big Russian reinforcement was coming in the same direction from the eastern side of Russia, which was called the Voronezh Front. And they were approaching roughly in the same direction as the Germans and were bound to meet. The Germans tried their best to avoid this by having another army group, it was called Army Group Kemp, which were supposed to protect their open flank as they marched north. However, this army group was bogged down and could not reach the place in time, so the Germans marched towards Prokhorovka, and so did the Russians.
By the 11th of July, Hoth's forces were only 12 miles from the town of Oboyan. This was where the Russians had centered their defenses for the whole of the southern part of the Kursk salient, and the Germans knew that this area was a Russian strongpoint. Army Detachment Kempf was fighting to the southeast, towards Razavets. Hoth planned to turn to the east away from Oboyan and destroy the enemy to the south. He could then link with Kempf's forces and force a new path towards Kursk. The town that lay in Hoth's way was Prokhorovka. Success at Prokhorovka was essential to the continuation of the German advance. Up to the 12th of July 1943, Prokhorovka was an unknown village. By the end of that day, it would earn its place in the history of the Second World War. The Russians, who could see the threat posed by the SS-led armored advance, poured strong armored reserves into this area. Among these reserves was the 5th Guards Tank Army, who were placed northeast of Prokhorovka alongside the 5th Guards Army. The 5th Guards Tank Army could boast a strength of 850 various tanks, including T-34s and KV-1s. At this stage, the Russians estimated that the German armored advance consisted of 700 vehicles. The truth, however, was very different. Hoth's SS force had been severely weakened by the advance through the extensive enemy defenses. By the 11th of July, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps could only muster 300 battle-ready machines. A further 230 German armored vehicles were fighting to their left with the rest of Hoth's forces. One major failure on the part of the Germans was the fact that they failed to detect the formidable enemy force that lay in wait for them. Hoth felt confident that the enemy had been severely weakened and that the German attack would open up the east flank and push the enemy back towards Oberjan. All of this assembled armor was situated in an area of less than 3 square miles. The start of the great armored clash was preceded by air attacks launched by both sides. The Russians also delivered an artillery attack towards the German lines. This was quickly followed by the start of the Russian tank advance. Almost at the same time, the Germans moved from their start points towards the Russian lines. The two sides met head-on, and a state of extreme confusion soon developed. Any hope of control over these formations was lost, as both sides locked horns in a close-range struggle for survival. At such short range, the German Tigers and Panthers could not rely upon their far superior long-range guns. At this range, the T-34s and other Russian machines found that they could destroy the German monsters as easily as they could be destroyed themselves. Also, in acts of suicide, Russian tanks were seen driving straight into the Tigers and ramming them. The resultant explosion assured the complete destruction of both machines. Due to the close-range fighting, the planes and artillery from both sides could not play any part in deciding the outcome. The danger of destroying friendly forces was too great. The entire battle had lasted for 12 hours. In this short space of time, the finest divisions in Hitler's army had been fought to a standstill. They had suffered heavy infantry casualties and could not break through the Russian lines. At the end of this time, both sides settled back and assumed defensive positions. They both counted their losses and decided what to do next. The battle at Prokhorovka had resulted in losses for the Germans, but contrary to popular belief, these losses amounted to no more than 150 armored machines in total. The Germans managed to keep their battle-ready tank numbers at a fairly even number around this period. The majority of their losses had taken place in the first few days of the Kursk offensive. After Prokhorovka, the Germans simply lacked the strength and forces necessary to continue the advance. By this stage, they were completely exhausted. The Russian tank losses during Prokhorovka stood at around 400 tanks, and this spelt a temporary setback in this area for them. In the overall plan, they knew that they had yet to deliver the main attack elsewhere. Throughout the night of July the 12th, the Russians and Germans recovered what vehicles they could from Prokhorovka and returned them to the repair shops in an attempt to make their losses good. The engineers destroyed whatever could not be recovered. Smaller-scale fighting did continue in this area for the next few days, but the fact was that both the Russians and Germans were exhausted. Hitler called off the Citadel offensive on the 13th of July. As the clash of tanks was taking place at Prokhorovka, the Russians were preparing for the counterattack in other areas. They had amassed a formidable attacking force in the north of the salient. Even as the German offensive continued, they began their probing attacks on the 12th of July near Orel. The Germans began to fall back under the weight of this attack. They were weakened beyond repair, and on top of this, Hitler withdrew the elite 1st SS Panzer Division and sent them south towards the new threat in Italy. At the start of August, the Russian offensive began in full. It quickly gained ground, and less than a week after the start of the attack, the Russians had retaken most of the lost areas. By the end of August, they even managed Kharkov. This was the fourth and last time this Russian city would change hands. In some areas, the going was tough for the Russians. The Germans had dug in well and got the chance to exact a measure of revenge for the losses they had endured. Von Manstein himself directed these defensive battles, but the end was now in sight. Germany had thrown the elite of its armored forces into this battle in an attempt to win the decisive victory it needed. Hitler had placed all of his hopes in the Waffen-SS formations that had won him victory at Kharkov in March. He ensured that they were given preference in receiving the new Panthers and Tigers. But not even these new heavy tanks could win the day. At the end of this struggle, these units, together with the rest of the forces involved, had suffered heavy losses in men and machines. This was to be the last offensive operation mounted by the Germans in the East. What it spelled for the Germans was the start of the end of the Russian campaign. The armies of Adolf Hitler faced a one-way move back towards their homeland. Not even the elite SS formations could give Hitler the victory he needed. Local successes did take place, but they were not enough to alter the final outcome. For the Russians, it allowed them to seize the decisive advantage over the Germans. The carefully planned counterattack tore large gaps in the German front line. They had at last proved that the mighty German army was beatable. With regard to tanks, sheer numerical superiority overwhelmed the technical superiority of the Panthers and Tigers. This victory did provide a beacon for the whole world. The victory, however, lay not with the forces of Hitler, but with the forces of Stalin. During the dark days of August 1942, there was still every chance that Hitler might yet win World War II. Although America had been dragged into the conflict by Hitler's rash declaration of war, it would take years to assemble a real fighting force in continental Europe. In the meantime, British Empire forces still effectively stood alone against the might of Hitler's forces in the West. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army was under immense pressure from the great German offensive, which had taken the Sixth Army to the gates of Stalingrad. And Stalin was increasingly vocal in his demands for a second front. In order to demonstrate that Britain was not entirely impotent, and to prepare for the day when British forces would be required to stage a full-scale invasion of the continent, a large-scale raid in force was planned against the German-held town of Dieppe.
The Russians, don't forget, had been trying to insist that the British mount a second front for some years. As early as 1942, there was no way the Allies could have mounted an invasion across Channel until they were absolutely prepared.
One of the features of the Dieppe raid was the first deployment of a new British tank, known as the Churchill. These early tanks had specially adapted exhaust outlets to allow them to operate in water up to 6 feet in depth. Despite the deployment of 29 of these, the very latest machines to reach the army, the attack on Dieppe was nothing short of a disaster.
It always strikes me as odd that we should have taken what was then effectively our most top-secret weapon and plonked it on a beach in France, which we almost certainly some of them were going to get captured. So it was the first time it had been used. It at that time had a dreadful reputation for unreliability, which didn't help. And it was only its great ability to absorb punishment which seems to have been the reason that it was used there at all.
Confronted by a series of concrete anti-tank barricades and an extensive system of anti-tank ditches, the new tanks failed to clear their way off the beach and into the town. Casualties were high, and the entry of the Churchill was not an auspicious success.
The Canadians used Churchill tanks in that raid, and they came horribly unstuck, partly because the tanks did not behave very well on the beach. They tended to pick up the stones that broke their tracks. But those that did get ashore, that got well off the seawall onto the promenade, then found they couldn't get any further because the Germans had blocked the streets with enormous concrete blocks, and they completely prevented anyone from working their way into the town. At the time, there was nothing they could do. The Canadian Royal Engineers would simply operate on their feet, carrying packs of explosives with them. And these men were cut down before they got anywhere near the targets half the time.
Nonetheless, the Canadians fought hard, and despite the fact that the tanks could not get off the beach, they actually managed to establish a foothold in the town. But as the superior German forces gained the upper hand, large numbers of exhausted prisoners were gathered together to parade for the cameras, and the German newsreels had an unexpected field day.
The 28 modern tanks which landed were all destroyed.
These images of the knocked-out Churchill tanks proved to be a great propaganda coup for the Germans, who were presented with brand new examples of the latest British technology for study, evaluation, and as trophies of war.
The Germans captured, obviously, every single one that landed. None of them got back. Their view of the Churchill was so dismissive that beyond testing a few, they never even bothered using them. I think they came to the conclusion that we meant to throw them away because they were useless. Interesting that in the end, of course, the Churchill comes back to haunt them right to the end of the war.
Despite the unhappy scenes of defeat, the Dieppe raid did provide a great deal of valuable experience for the Allies, which would be put to use in the D-Day landings 2 years later. Against all expectations, the Churchills would be back, and they would play a crucial role in the events of June 1944. Despite the adverse experience at Dieppe, the sturdy hull of the Churchill tank was chosen as the basis for a highly versatile range of specialist machines, known by the initials AVRE, which stood for Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers. They were formed into a special command of the 79th Armoured Division under Major P.C.S. Hobart.
He trained what was known as the 1st Tank Brigade in Britain in the 30s. He was then sent out to the Middle East to train what became the famous 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. He did it extremely well, and the men adored him. He pulled out and was given command. He first of all trained the 11th Armoured Division, which was a conventional armoured division, always training them to an absolutely incredibly high standard. He then took over 79th, which originally was just going to be another regular armoured division, and was commanding it when the order came through to change to the development of specialised armour. Now, it would be wrong to credit Hobart with the invention of any of this stuff. He was not a technical man, he was a tactician and a training expert. A lot of the ideas that he pulled in came from other sources.
As a direct result of the experience gained in the Dieppe raid, an ingenious variety of AVREs were designed to assist in the real attack on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The most important of these was a special adaptation of the Churchill, which had its main gun replaced by a massive 290mm mortar known as a petard. This device could hurl a huge explosive charge which was intended to blow apart concrete defences of the type which had proved so effective against the tanks at Dieppe.
It's basically a Churchill tank, but it's been modified. It's a combined demolition vehicle and sort of multi-purpose field engineering tank. At has no anti-tank gun or anything like that. Instead, it has this enormous thing known as a petard mortar, which fires an equally enormous thing called a flying dustbin over a very short distance, which will then demolish pretty well anything it gets anywhere near.
In a throwback to the days of World War I, the hull of the AVRE was also found to be capable of carrying a bundle of wood 8 feet in diameter, known as a fascine. This unlikely cargo could be dropped into an anti-tank ditch to create a simple bridge to allow tanks to cross. For crossing larger obstacles, such as sea walls, the AVRE could also be adapted to carry a box girder bridge with a span of 30 feet, which was capable of carrying vehicles up to 40 tons in weight. In the event that the soft sand of the beaches would prove too difficult for tanks to cross, yet another variation on the AVRE was developed. This one carrying what was known as a bobbin, a huge reel of canvas which was unrolled in front of the tank to allow the vehicle to cross areas of soft sand. In order to prevent exploding mines making huge craters in the soft sand of the beach, there was also a variant of the AVRE which carried a huge plow on the front of the tank, which was designed to bring mines to the surface so that they could be detonated later on. Finally, in the list of specialist machines, which had become affectionately known to the troops as Hobart's Funnies, was a demolition version of the AVRE.
Most of these things consisted of a frame which was hinged onto the front of the tank from these various brackets along here, and this frame carried with it a whole load of plastic explosive charges, different quantities for different obstacles. Some of them you just drove the tank up, you stopped at the wall, you laid the charge against the wall and backed away. Some were actually hooked, so you hooked them over the wall. You then went off to a respectable distance, trailing electric wires, and blew up the wall.
While the specialist machines were at work on their particular tasks, they still needed the support of conventional armor to protect them against anti-tank guns or enemy tanks. For that purpose, the Allies relied on 2 main variants of the trusty Sherman tank. The first of these was the duplex drive or DD swimming tank, which used a collapsible canvas screen and a propeller mounted on the back of the tank to allow the vehicle to swim ashore and reach the shallow water where they could neutralize enemy anti-tank positions, while the specialist tanks went about their work of breaching the enemy defenses.
It seemed almost chaos when we landed because there was shouting everywhere of come this way, go that way, but it wasn't. It was orderly chaos.
The Allied plan for the Battle of Normandy was exceptionally sound and exceptionally safe, but it had to be. This battle absolutely had to succeed. If the Allies had been defeated on D-Day, if they'd been defeated in the Battle of Normandy, it is almost impossible to say what the future consequences would have been for the Second World War.
It was not just the Allies who had learned the lessons of Dieppe. The German High Command also realized that their defenses could be improved. In particular, their sea defenses needed to be much more effective against the Allied tanks, which the Germans now knew were capable of swimming their way ashore from ships moored a considerable distance out to sea. A careful study of the results of the battle at Dieppe proved the value of both concrete obstacles and anti-tank ditches. In addition, thousands of anti-tank obstacles were placed beneath the high water mark, which were designed to make it very difficult for armor to reach the shore. To complete the task of preparing the Atlantic Wall, Hitler chose Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He was appointed in January 1944.
The Atlantic Wall, opposite D-Day, was commanded by General Rommel, my father's old adversary from the desert. And of course he thought he understood indeed very well what Rommel was about.
Rommel believed that the only chance for defeating the Allied invasion was to do so on the D-Day beaches and drive it into the sea. This famous phrase of his chief of staffs, which he picked up and used, that this would be the longest day. What he meant by that was if the Allies were allowed at the end of D-Day still to be ashore, then Allied strength would mean that victory in the Battle of Normandy for them would be inevitable, and there was nothing the Germans could do.
One of the main elements of Rommel's defensive strategy lay in a massive belt of anti-tank mines along the entire length of the coast, which in places stretched to a depth of half a mile from the shoreline. This first line was intended to be backed up by an additional belt of mines, up to 5 miles deep, sited further inland. It has been calculated that this grandiose scheme would have required 200 million mines to complete. Despite the more limited resources available to him, Rommel still boasted that the beaches would become what he described as a zone of death. Although the Atlantic Wall was still far from complete in mid-1944, the defences were fairly well advanced in the Normandy area, and a considerable effort on the Allied side went into the development of vehicles which could be used to clear a path through the minefields. One such vehicle was the second main variant of the Sherman tank, known as the Crab.
The Crab is really an amalgamation of the American Sherman tank and a British mine-sweeping flail device. The flail is a drum here with these huge chains hanging from it. It's driven from the tank's own engine through a gearbox, and the whole thing rotates relatively slowly. The chains fly around pretty vigorously, thrashing the ground as they go along and exploding anti-tank mines in the path of the tank. Sometimes when the blow goes off, the bang is so strong, the blast is so strong, actually lifts the whole jib up at the front. It goes up in the air, goes thumping back down again, but it's still going round, it's still thrashing the ground, and if the odd one flies off, the odds are still in your favour. So at the end of the day, of course, the tank needs a lot of work done on it for its next flailing job. There are instances where the Germans latterly came up with a very unseemly trick of laying a conventional mine linked to an aircraft bomb. The tank would drive over the aircraft bomb flailing and not upset it. The flails would strike the mine would detonate the aircraft bomb, which by then was under the tank, and that was the end of the Crab completely.
With this mind-boggling collection of specialist vehicles at his disposal, Hobart's 79th Division resembled a contractor's yard, with a specialist machine for almost every conceivable application.
This is actually what's known as the crocodile version of the Churchill, and this is a flamethrower. This would spout highly combustible jelly, which would then be ignited to burn enemy strong points and on occasion enemy men. So it's a very inhuman and nasty weapon. It had a little trailer which was attached to the back which housed the fuel, and in action this would provide enough bursts of fire for about 3 minutes in action. Thereafter this weapon would be redundant and the crew would rely on the normal 6-pounder up in the turret here.
It was usually employed against really stubborn defences, and the classic example is the French fortress at Brest, which the Germans were holding, and it became such an obstinate target that they borrowed some Crocodile tanks and their crews from British 79th Armoured Division and brought them up for a demonstration. And once the Germans had witnessed what these things could do, they quickly changed their minds and surrendered.
We were glad of the Churchills because the snipers were in foxholes, and the only way to get them out was a flamethrower. Must have been a horrible death, but I actually think it must have been pretty well instantaneous.
The British and Canadian forces operating on D-Day, possibly with the experience of Dieppe still in mind, took full advantage of Hobart and his funnies, as the vehicles were affectionately known. The American General Bradley, however, is alleged to have declined all offers of assistance, and this was to have disastrous consequences for the American forces fighting on Omaha Beach.
The old argument that we didn't invent it, therefore it can't be any good, is the one that's put forward. I think if we look at it, the 79th Armoured Division simply wasn't big enough to serve three armies. It was already serving the British and Canadian armies. I think if we'd have extended it ourselves to support the Americans, except in very special cases, we would have been spread too thin. As to why the Americans didn't adopt specialised armour themselves, the Churchill would have been an anachronism to them anyway. It was so different from anything they produced that they would never have got used to it. It's a dreadful tank by American standards. So for that reason they wouldn't have. And they did take flails later on, and the US engineers developed their own range of vehicles which just never came into action in time. They were a bit behind us on that.
On D-Day itself, the experience of the DD swimming tanks varied massively from beach to beach.
Probably the most spectacular failure were the swimming tanks, the DD tanks, in the early part of the operation. In the sectors where they were successful, they did very well indeed. The tanks swam ashore or drove ashore if they felt it was too rough to swim, and did what they were supposed to do in the main. On certain sectors, and I would cite particularly of some of the American beaches, they launched too far out, they launched into very bad seas and a crosswind, whereas the British and Canadians were heading straight into it. And they certainly lost a lot of tanks and a lot of men, but probably a bit more liberal interpretation of what they were for would have solved that problem.
At Omaha Beach, 28 out of 30 DD tanks sank to the ocean floor, many taking their crews with them. Deprived of armor support, casualties among the American infantry on Omaha were the highest on D-Day. On the Canadian Juno Beach, the situation was more positive, and 21 out of 34 DD tanks made it to the shore. Overall, the British had better luck than either the Canadians or the Americans, and 31 out of 34 DD tanks launched at Sword Beach made it to the shore. On Juno Beach, the Double D tanks were particularly effective in assisting the Canadian infantry, who had been pinned down by some well-prepared German defenses. The arrival of the swimming tanks soon neutralized the German anti-tank guns and allowed the advance to continue inland. Also on Juno Beach, the AVRE machines proved that they could be highly effective. Not only did they successfully clear the beach of mines, but using their petards they were able to breach the sea wall and drop fascines into the anti-tank ditch, which allowed the supporting infantry to attack German strongpoints in the houses behind the beach. Here too, they played a vital role, and they were able to offer assistance to the infantry by demolishing German strongpoints.
Le Havre was a port. It was impossible to get at from the sea. It was so well defended, so it had to be attacked from behind, but it was well fortified in both directions. And this was a classic example of all the specialised armour, the flamethrowers, the flails, the Avries with all their various trimmings and fittings, all working as a team. And what they did, they selected a number of lanes, and then each section of 79th Armoured Div would go in, it would do its appointed job, and then it would clear off. And then the real armour, the fighting armour and the infantry go in and took the port, and it was done brilliantly, very smoothly and very quickly.
Of 50 Crabs and 128 AVREs deployed on D-Day, 12 Crabs were knocked out, and 22 of the AVREs, a mercifully small sacrifice for so much progress. As commander of Allied 21st Army Group, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had the enormous responsibility of leading the forces on the ground during the Normandy campaign of 1944.
When my father was asked to command Operation Overlord, his first move was to talk to Eisenhower in North Africa, and then go to Churchill to explain that the original plan to have a 3-division front would not work, and it needed to be expanded to a 5-division plan. And indeed, this was the plan that he launched when he got back to England at the beginning of January 1944.
He set a very precise strategy for the campaign, which was outlined at a meeting of senior commanders in St Paul's School, London, on May the 15th, 1944. It was intended that the 4 Allied corps which landed on the 5 beaches on D-Day would penetrate to a depth of about 10 kilometers inland and capture the towns of Bayeux and Caen. By D-Day plus 10, the Allies would have secured the line of high ground running from Saint-Lô to Villers-Bocage. While the British engaged the German forces in a battle which was intended to be fought south of Caen, it was planned that Patton's Third Army would expand southwards in a grand encircling movement designed to trap the German forces, and by D-Day plus 90, the Allies would be encamped along the River Seine and Paris would be in their hands. By committing his forces around Caen, it was the British who would face the bulk of the German armour. Although new types of tank were beginning to reach the German forces, they still had to rely on older designs to fill the bulk of the panzer divisions.
The majority of German tanks in Normandy were not Tigers and Panthers. Rather, they were a rather obsolescent model, the Panzer IV, which had in fact been around since the late 1930s in one model or another.
This is the Panzer Mark IV. Now, it's not as glamorous a machine as the Panther and the Tiger, which always seem to take the spotlight in any discussion of German armour, but this was the real workhorse. It really was an incredible machine because it was in service from the outbreak of the war and continued to be manufactured through all the changes right into 1945. One of the reasons for that is it proved itself to be supremely capable of being up-armoured and upgraded as the situation demanded, and this tank is a particularly good example of that. We can see on the front here, it's had all of this additional armour bolted on to the front of the tank, which brings a lot of weight, but the vehicle can still cope with it. More importantly, up in the turret there, we've got this new high-velocity 75mm anti-tank gun, and there are very few tanks where you could go from what was a short-barreled small gun in that turret to a massive gun like that and still be able to use the same vehicle. But that's what's happened with the Panzer IV. The Allies were much more likely to encounter a Panzer IV than they were a Panther or a Tiger. Nonetheless, all of the Allied forces began to refer to any German tank as a Tiger, and for that reason, frequently this is the machine that they would have seen when they would have reported that they saw a Tiger.
There can be few campaigns in the history of warfare which were as meticulously planned and so heavily insured against failure as the D-Day landings of 1944. The Anglo-American forces which stormed ashore on Hitler's fortress Europe enjoyed an overwhelming superiority in men, ammunition, ships, tanks, planes, and all the rest of the panoply of war.
By the time the war developed to the Normandy campaign, the Allied tank strength was far numerically superior to the German. That is down to the American productivity. America being away from the war zone, it wasn't being bombed, where certainly in Britain our tank production was limited by the size of our war effort. In Germany's case, they were being bombed night and day. Their tank supplies were limited to their raw materials as well. They were producing probably about 20,000 tanks a year, but 23,000 tanks were being destroyed by 1945. So their numbers were actually decreasing.
The 6th of June 1944 would see two considerable armed forces pitted against one another in the Normandy area. Something like 160,000 Allied troops in 3 airborne and 5 and a bit amphibiously landed infantry divisions were deployed in Normandy on the 6th of June against German defenders of varying quality, it should be said, but quite considerable numbers.
During the landings, and for up to 20 miles inland, the Allied forces could rely on the massive guns of the Allied battleships, which were capable of firing devastating barrages of heavy artillery fire against the German forces. Even for those Germans who had fought in Russia, naval gunfire proved to be a devastating experience, which was shocking in its intensity. The power of the heavy shells from the 16-inch guns of the battleships produced a barrage which was so intense that Tiger tanks, which weighed 56 tons, were flipped onto their sides like children's toys. In the opening days of the Normandy campaign, the Allies could rely upon the support of 9 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 73 destroyers. On land, the situation of the Germans was, if anything, worse. 4 years of savage warfare in Russia had drained the strength of the German army. For the duration of the Normandy campaign, only 20% of the available German forces could be committed to the war in the West.
From 1941 through to 1944, about 2/3 of all the German warfighting resources were being tied up in the war against the Soviet Union. What makes the Battle of Normandy important is that German resources by June 1944 are so tremendously overstretched. They have no real strategic reserves. So by opening up the famous Second Front, and by forcing the Germans to commit their troops to Normandy, this is the overstretch which breaks the back of the German armed forces.
One of the great successes of the Normandy campaign was the secrecy with which the whole operation was shrouded. The Germans were completely deceived as to the place and date of the landings, right up to the moment the first troops came ashore. In the air, the Allies had an even greater advantage. On D-Day itself, 5,000 Allied fighters filled the sky and swept away the 119 German fighters which opposed them. With their superiority of 50-1, rocket-firing Typhoons of the Allied Air Force had a field day combing the terrain behind the Normandy beaches for any sign of movement on the ground.
We went a little further down the road, and 4 Panther tanks had been knocked out by Typhoons. And they were on the railway line. They'd been travelling up the railway line. And they were really wicked, those Typhoon rockets. We used to sort of give up a cheer every time the Typhoons came when they went into the attack, because we often saw them at Caprica Aerodrome. We were entrenched on the edge of Caprica Aerodrome, and the Canadians were trying to capture it, and they were assisted by these Typhoons with their rockets. It was fantastic.
This complete, virtually, air supremacy possessed by the Allies was put to extremely good use during the Battle of Normandy. Allied bombers could reduce German beach defences. Allied bombers could cut German lines of communication, thus paralysing the build-up of German forces opposite the amphibiously and airborne landed British and American forces. And of course, tactical air support could create absolute havoc for any German unit in Normandy, foolish enough to try to move in strength by day.
Newsreels of the period show German vehicles covered in branches, in an attempt to disguise any vehicle movements from the air. On the German side, the Allied air superiority was just one of a number of serious disadvantages which had to be overcome if they were to conduct a successful campaign in Normandy. Chief among these was the confusion and disorganization which prevailed in the chain of command. As Supreme Commander, Adolf Hitler constantly dabbled in every aspect of the forces at his command.
Commanding all the forces in the West, responsible for France, Belgium and Holland, is Oberkommando West, OB West, based in Paris, under the 69-year-old Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt. And he is simultaneously in command of Army Group B, which is responsible for the defence of Normandy, and this is commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And at the same time, Rommel is also his superior, because Rommel has a watching brief from Hitler for the defence of the whole of Western Europe. Also, Rommel, who is one of Hitler's favourites, has direct access to Hitler, which von Rundstedt does not. He has to go through the German hierarchy. There is this quite deliberate confusion of two field marshals competing with each other to be in charge of the German organisation.
By 1944, the flaws which affected the High Command were also reflected in the declining quality of the men in the ranks. The steady war of attrition in Russia meant that the Wehrmacht had to accept lower and lower standards of physical fitness for new recruits. Men who would previously have been refused for the armed services had to be called into action. The German army also had to allow the deployment of the 12th SS Panzer Division, better known as the Hitler Youth Division. This division was led by experienced officers, drawn from the famous SS Leibstandarte Division, and the ranks were filled almost entirely by teenagers.
The Germans have a handful of good units, and then units which are under strength, which are poorly equipped, which have poor transport. And for the idea of the German fighting Superman, about 1 in 10 in Rommel's Army Group B were not actually German. And in the front lines on D-Day, manning the pillbox positions, that may have been as high as 1 in 4.
Among the Nazi satellites are Russian Mongols, probably forced into service by the Nazis. Back on the beach, prisoners continue to pour in. Many who surrendered were stunned by the fury of the Allied onslaught and laid down their arms voluntarily.
The overwhelming demands of a war on 3 fronts posed hosts of additional problems for the German logistics and supply system. Allied fighters and fighter bombers had not restricted their attacks just to the troops on the ground. They also carried out a massive air and interdiction campaign against the German supply lines. Roads and railway lines were mercilessly targeted, which meant that supplies of essential fuel and ammunition stocks could not reach the hard-pressed front line.
I remember once we went out on a recce, and we went down a road to this little village, and there were dead horses that were still harnessed to the German guns. And I was so surprised to see that the Germans were still using horses to draw their artillery up to battle.
As the Allied breakout began to materialise at the end of July and into August 1944, the inability of the Germans to provide large quantities of petrol for their tanks and other vehicles did badly damage their ability to launch any significant counterstroke against the Allies as they broke through.
To offset the many disadvantages which faced the German troops fighting on the ground in Normandy, they did enjoy some real advantages over the Allies. Many of the panzer divisions which would be used to face the Allies had a strong core of battle-hardened troops, which had already seen 4 years of brutal warfare.
Although the German tank crews were vastly outnumbered by their Allied counterparts, they had the advantage of experience which very few of the Allied tank crews had, apart from those in the 7th Armoured Division who'd fought in Italy and in North Africa.
Well, German forces had had a great deal of battle experience. I mean, they had fought very professionally on both fronts for a very long time. So indeed had the British. The interesting, I think, aspect of this is that the American forces, who played such a vital part, of course had much less battle experience, which I always feel is probably one of the reasons why my father assigned them the breakout role rather than the holding role in the initial stages of the operation.
The German forces also enjoyed a very real superiority in the quality of their tank forces. Not only were the crews hugely experienced and battle-hardened by years on the Russian front, the tanks themselves were far better than those used by the Allies.
The main tanks used by the Panzer divisions in Normandy in 1944 were the Panther, the Tiger and the Panzer IV, along with the Stug III. Compared with the Allied tanks, they had always had superior armaments, they had superior sighting equipment, they had superior armour. The armour plating was always sloped, and if we see behind us, the perfect example is the Cromwell. We can see that the armour plate is actually at 90 degrees, which means if that armour is only 4 inches thick, the projectile has only got to go through 4 inches of armour plate. Had that steel been angled at 45 degrees, it would have increased the distance the projectile would have to go through the armour by 50%. So for a given weight of steel, you could actually get 50% more protection. The Allied tanks did not have this protection. The German tanks did.
Now the Cromwell first saw action in Normandy, but again this tank was actually a 1942 design. It was originally designed and started to be built in 1942, but Normandy was the first battle it actually saw any service with. It was an improvement on earlier wartime British designs, but it was still lightly armoured and lightly armed compared with the Panther and the Tiger.
Time and time again, Allied tank soldiers described the disheartening experience of seeing their own shells bounce off the armour of the German tanks.
The Tiger tank then proceeded to turn round and came on my side of the hedge, and so therefore it was my perfect target. And I fired 5 projectiles at the Tiger tank, and on the 5th one I think he got fed up with me hitting him with my little Piat, and he decided to let go with his big gun. And as I fired the last one, he fired, and it landed on my left. And you have seen how close it was to my eyes by the hole in the centre of the spectacles that you have here.
I feel throughout the entire war that we were generally always fighting with inferior equipment and armaments, and I think this is one of the demonstrations of the skill of both the Allied command and the qualities of the British soldier, that despite the fact that we had inferior equipment in many cases, that we were able to succeed.
Following the D-Day landings, most of the Allied objectives were achieved on that crucial first day, with one major exception: the capture of Caen. The city, which should have been in Allied hands by the end of D-Day +1, was to remain in German hands until July the 18th, 6 weeks after the beginning of the battle. The reasons for the successful defense at Caen lay in the extremely difficult nature of the bocage country in which the campaign was fought.
Of course, the bocage country is that part of Normandy inland from the sea. It's a land of small farms, tiny fields, and over the years, these fields have been ploughed out and rebuilt, and they'd ended up with very high earth banks all around the edges of them. Into the earth bank, the farmer would plant hedgerows and trees. So you ended up with tiny, sunken, narrow lanes and a crisscross sort of pattern of these little fields all over the place.
In the bocage, the tank crews couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of them. Anti-tank guns could be hidden in the fields, they could be hidden in the hedges, and the tanks had no choice but to drive along the lanes, the sunken lanes, where they were sitting ducks as far as the German anti-tank crews and the German tank crews were concerned.
To actually get off the roads into the fields, you normally had to break through the thick hedgerows, which normally meant you exposed the weaker part of your tank to the enemy fire. The Americans came up with one or two novel ways of actually doing that. They put a device on the front of some of their tanks, which was a very crude form of hedge cutter.
And all it was a kind of jagged tooth-like thing fitted to the front of the tank. And the theory behind it, at least, was that the tank with this device would charge at the bank, and instead of rising up over it, would slice off the top and make a little cutting for itself and whiz through, and everybody else then followed through the gap this fellow had made. It's only limited success because obviously the tank's going to start rising first before the hedgerow cutter sort of cuts in. And secondly, it's going to slow the tank down almost to a halt. So sometimes they may have had to have more than one go. And both the Canadians and the British used it, of course, as well as the United States Army.
In this difficult environment, the advantage was with the defender, and the bocage soon became known to the Allies as the Green Hell. Faced with their inability to take the remaining objective, the British High Command had no alternative but to fight in the bocage. As casualties steadily mounted, the airfield at Carpiquet, on the outskirts of Caen, became a vital target. It was tenaciously defended by the youngsters of the Hitler Youth Division against a series of assaults by superior British forces. In an attempt to outflank these stubborn defenders at Carpiquet, Montgomery dispatched his highly experienced 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, to make a broad sweep south of Caen, which was scheduled to begin on June the 12th. The attack was aimed at the small town of Villers-Bocage, and it was here that one of the most famous tank actions of the war would be fought. The Allied spearhead was halted and almost single-handedly destroyed in a fierce battle through the streets and fields surrounding Villers-Bocage by German Tiger tanks of the 101st Heavy Battalion, led by the famous tank commander, Michael Wittmann.
Wittmann, literally one tank, destroyed such a large collection of British armoured vehicles, including Cromwell's, that it showed that our armour design was still some way behind the Germans, and it needed to be improved, which it was later in the war.
In a single day, the British forces lost over 60 tanks and a huge number of accompanying vehicles. By nightfall on July the 13th, Villers-Bocage was back in German hands.
The defeat of the 7th Armoured Division at Villers-Bocage represented really the loss of the last real opportunity to make the Battle for Normandy the mobile battle which the Allied planners hoped and indeed expected that it would be.
Montgomery decided to try one last offensive. Designed to capture the territory south of Caen, it was codenamed Operation Goodwood and scheduled for the 17th of July. Goodwood began with an overwhelming air, naval and artillery bombardment designed to blast a path for 750 tanks to advance towards the high ground south of Caen. Once again, their opponents were to be men of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, many of whom had been in action since June the 8th. In the steady war of attrition, the SS Corps had been reduced to a strength of just 100 tanks, but they could still command deep defensive positions of the bocage, and they were backed up with the deadly 88mm anti-tank guns. The opening Allied barrage was so intensive, it was described by some German veterans as the biggest and most intense artillery bombardment they had ever witnessed, even in Russia. Despite massive preparations which were made, Goodwood was an even greater failure than the previous offensives. Although the southern sector of Caen was cleared of the enemy, the Allies lost 200 tanks in a single day as they tried to cross the Orne. Fighting for Caen continued until July the 20th, but once again the operation had to be postponed, with part of the city still in German hands.
Operation Goodwood is perhaps the most controversial of all of Montgomery's battles during the Normandy campaign. Measuring its success or failure really depends on what you believe Operation Goodwood was intended to achieve. If, for example, you believe what some people believe, that the attack was supposed to be a breakthrough attack, then quite clearly it failed to do that.
Montgomery, with hindsight, would claim that the deliberate intention of this attack was to tie down the last of the German armoured reserves against British Second Army, so enabling US First Army to break out on the 25th in Operation Cobra.
Despite all the British had done, Operation Cobra still faced some tough fighting before the American forces were finally able to break out of the bocage and sweep southwards into open country. As the American offensive began to gather pace, the British forces took advantage of the confusion in the German ranks to form the northern pincer in this huge encircling movement, which was designed to trap the German forces in Normandy in a huge pocket centered on the town of Falaise. In the face of continued resistance, the British forces kept up the drive southwards, and by August the 20th they had linked up with the American forces to close a ring around Falaise. It was now that the Allied Air Force swept in for the kill. 10,000 Germans died in the incessant air attacks. 50,000 more were taken prisoner. These men represented the remains of 40 German divisions which had been destroyed in the Battle for Normandy. 4/5 of the German army who had been committed to the campaign in Normandy had been destroyed. Montgomery had won his battle, and exactly as planned, the Allies were on the River Seine by D-Day plus 90. After the German failure at Kursk, even Hitler had at last begun to realize that it was now impossible to inflict a serious defeat on the Russians. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, Hitler did believe that a well-executed offensive in the West could defeat the Western Allies and free up much-needed forces for the East to at least try and halt the Russian advances. With his planned Western offensive, he believed that he could force the Allies to sue for peace from a stalemate position. But even Hitler must have known that this was the last chance for the panzers.
The basic reason for the Ardennes offensive was that in late 1944, Germany was obviously facing defeat within a measurable period of time. In the west, the British and American forces were closing up on the Rhine, and in the east, the Russians were poised to invade East Germany and flood on into Berlin.
Hitler decided that he needed to sustain the war, and the one way was to counter-offensive in the west and try and split the armies in the west, and then hopefully we would sue for peace, and then he could turn all his attention through to Russia. This resulted in a battle in the Ardennes, which is quite commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge.
By a small miracle of logistics, the hard-pressed Germans of the Third Reich somehow managed to scrape together the men and machines for one last great offensive. In the middle of December 1944, Hitler launched his surprise winter offensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium. For this offensive, 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles had somehow been assembled. After the destructive battles through France in the summer, this force represented the very last reserves of manpower. Hitler placed all of his hopes on this, the last great offensive in the West during World War II.
The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last gamble, because he committed all of his forces in the West, the entire armies and air forces, to the Ardennes offensive. And if that offensive failed, he had no reserves, and there was nothing to stop the Allies going into Germany.
The plan for the attack was fairly straightforward. The Ardennes region provided a successful launchpad for the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940. Once again, Hitler planned to push a strong armor-led thrust through the Allied-held positions and on to Antwerp.
The Ardennes offensive, or as the Germans called it, the von Rundstedt offensive, as the Americans called it, the Battle of the Bulge, the idea of this offensive was to split the Allied forces, the British and the Canadians in the north and the Americans in the south, split the Allied forces and aim for the port of Antwerp, which was by then the main port for the supplies for the Allied armies. It would achieve several objectives. It would cut off the supplies to the Allied armies. It would also split the Allied armies, and the Germans were well aware of the personality conflicts and clashes between the various Allied commanders, and they thought that this would help. And they also thought that as they'd done it in 1940 and surprised the French by going through the Ardennes, they could do it in 1944.
Unlike 1940, however, the Germans were fighting an army who were used to their tactics. This time the Allies had better equipped forces that they could call upon to meet any threat. The terrain and supply problems did not favor the Germans this time either. The German generals could see the shortcomings of the offensive, but at this late stage in the war, few of them dared to question Hitler's authority for fear of their lives.
There was perhaps some possibility of success for the Ardennes offensive, but it was a gambler's throw. Hitler was relying very much upon surprise, upon the hope that the winter weather would prevent Allied aircraft from taking to the air and interfering, that they would capture Allied fuel supplies to fuel the drive on. However, he did have 100 miles to go to Antwerp, and his generals rather thought that it might be better to go for a shorter victory to try to pin the Allied armies against the line of the River Meuse, about halfway towards Antwerp. He was risking, however, a lot upon surprise and upon the superiority and the fanaticism of his tank crews and infantry.
The Germans had been busy in developing new tanks and assault gun designs during this period. One of the most significant new designs was the Tiger II-B, or King Tiger. This tank weighed 68 tons and was manned by 5 crew members. The main armament was the dauntingly high-velocity 88mm L-71 cannon. This was backed up with 2 7.92mm machine guns. The armor protection was formidable, and the top speed was a respectable 24 miles an hour.
By 1944, in the end of 1944, German tank design had responded to the designs put forward by the Russians of the IS-2, and they had developed what is known as the King Tiger, or Tiger B. This was a very impressive vehicle. If it was used today, it would still be a very impressive vehicle. It had a very large gun, much larger than a normal Tiger. It was still an 88, but much longer. It had sloping armour, very similar to the Panther, but in a much bigger design. They only ever built around about 470 of these vehicles, but they were unfortunately only used in small quantities, and probably only 70 at any one time were available for use.
The King Tiger was ordered after Hitler demanded a tank that could mount the massively powerful L-71 main gun. Even the mighty Tiger I was unable to do this, so in January 1943, the order was placed for the new machine. The first vehicles came off the production line a year later.
Heavier tanks became necessary during the Second World War for all of the combatants, and the reason was that it was found that in combat, survival depended upon having a good big gun and lots of armour. If you had those, you could survive, but tanks that were more thinly skinned perished quite quickly.
The first 50 King Tigers were fitted with a turret made by Porsche, who were later to become famous for rather different reasons. The remaining 439 Tiger II's were fitted with the Henschel turret. The Porsche turrets were originally built for a Porsche design of the Tiger I. When this contract was unexpectedly awarded elsewhere, Porsche had already completed 50 turrets, and they were found to be large enough to accommodate the larger gun. The sole remaining example of this type can be found in the Tank Museum in Bovington.
This is the Sonderkraftzug 182, better known as the King Tiger. It really represents the absolute limits of tank design in World War II. In some respects, we've actually passed the limits, because at 75 tons, this vehicle really is too heavy for the suspension that's intended to take it and for the engine that's designed to drive it along. But it does have a number of features that you would see in post-war tanks, and as you can see, the lessons of World War II tank fighting had been incorporated into the Tiger II, because in addition to having this enormous thickness of armour, which is 180 millimetres thick, it's also beautifully sloped, so it was designed to deflect shots away from the vehicle, and that's what happened in practice. So in that respect, Germany had come very close to producing the ultimate machine on the battlefield. But that's all they'd done, they'd come close, because it had so many disadvantages that it completely outweighed the advantages it had.
The first time that King Tigers saw action was during the Allied invasion of France in June 1944. Around 15 King Tigers were involved in these battles. A full battalion of 45 King Tigers was later sent to the Arnhem area in September 1944. They helped to ensure that the Allied market garden operation was thwarted. They were next to feature in the coming German offensive in the Ardennes. Like the Tiger I, this tank was better suited to the open country, and the majority of them were sent east to battle with the advancing Russians. A full battalion of 45 tanks was earmarked for the assault. The SS 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, which was part of the 6th Panzer Army, was placed with Kampfgruppe Piper at the front of the armoured advance.
The spearhead of the Ardennes offensive was the King Tiger tank, which was the first time it was used en masse. The problem was that the King Tiger was too heavy, too large and too cumbersome to get through the very narrow valleys and through the forests that comprise the Ardennes.
Now, it may have been formidable on the battlefield, but there were a number of problems with regard to getting this thing into action. They were massively prone to breakdown. They were very difficult to keep running. The other thing that was likely to happen with the complete control of the air that the Allies had was that the Germans were unable to bring forward sufficient fuel to keep a beast like this running.
Besides tanks, the German forces had also come to rely upon turretless tank destroyers, which sacrificed the tank turrets in return for the ability to mount a bigger gun and better armor. They were also easier and cheaper to produce under the difficult conditions which the Germans now faced. They were also ideally suited for defensive warfare. By late 1944, the assault guns and tank destroyers had become a valuable addition to the German arsenal. Following on from earlier tank destroyer designs, the chassis of the King Tiger was adapted to create a new heavy tank destroyer, the Jagdtiger. The resulting monster weighed in at 70 tons and required a 6-man crew. The main armament was the massively powerful 128mm cannon, which fired a shell of such high velocity that it could blow apart any Allied tank by the massive power of the kinetic energy in the solid metal shell. The armor protection was a colossal 250mm thick. The speed of this machine was similar to the King Tiger at 24 miles an hour. For close defense, the Jagdtiger was equipped with 2 machine guns. One of these was the familiar MG-34. The other was the new MG-42, which quickly became a much feared weapon amongst the Allies due to its high rate of fire.
This is the Jagdtiger. It was the hunting version of the King Tiger, and this was the largest armoured vehicle to see service in World War II. Up above us here we have the 128mm anti-tank gun, which was big enough to destroy any tank at almost any range that it could see or hit the target. It was hugely armoured with this great metal box on top of the King Tiger chassis. Only 70 or 80 of these machines saw action in their own heavy tank battalion in the Ardennes campaign.
The Jagdtiger was a highly effective tank destroyer, but only a total of 70 Tiger II chassis were ever converted to the new design. This was enough to equip 2 heavy tank destroyer units. One of these, the 653rd saw action during the Ardennes offensive. This very imposing machine was more suited to the open country and not the close confines of the Ardennes. The overstressed engine and transmission did provide the crews with a few problems.
It was almost impossible to maintain. It had been designed and built in such short time scales that there wasn't really time to test them properly. If they had been tested properly, I think it would have been quickly proved that these things were well beyond the limit of the engine to drive it, and the suspension to bear it, and the tracks to carry it around. It suffered from all of the problems of the Tiger II in terms of being able to negotiate villages. In addition, it was so large, you couldn't really conceal it on the battlefield. So it was designed to stand there as a kind of a semi-mobile pillbox. It would take up a position, it would engage the Allied tanks at the longest possible range, because with this gun, we really had no answer to a machine like the Jagdtiger, and its only hope was to keep the Allied tanks at a sufficient distance that it could destroy them at a range before they could get close enough to fire their own guns.
Overall, this vehicle was an excellent destroyer of Allied tanks. But its introduction was too late in the war and the numbers too few to have any effect on the final outcome. The manufacture of assault guns was more cost-effective, and these types increasingly proved their worth on the battlefield. More and more resources were put into developing new designs, and the trend was not always to larger machines.
One vehicle which was produced in rather large numbers was a vehicle called a Hetzer. Now the Hetzer was a very, very small vehicle, but with a very large gun, and was actually probably one of the finest vehicles the Germans had used.
The Hetzer, in contrast to the 70 tons of the Jagdtiger, only weighed 16 tons and carried a 4-man crew in its interior. Despite its small size, it packed a punch as it was armed with a powerful 75mm L48 gun. It had a single 7.92mm machine gun for close quarter fighting. The armor protection was 60mm thick, but being of the sloped design actually increased the protective capabilities. The top speed was 26 miles an hour.
By the middle to late 1944, the Germans had developed their tank destroyer fleet into a vehicle very similar to the one behind. This is a Hetzer light tank destroyer, based on the 38T tank chassis. It became obsolete. Rather than discard it, they used it, adapted it, and this is what you've got. It uses a 75mm gun, which you could not put in the old 38T because it was not capable of taking that size gun. So you build a tank destroyer. They learnt the lessons from the T-34. As you can see, sloping armour. That increases the armour protection. The vehicle has a very low silhouette, but the same drawback as you got with Su-100s and the other tank destroyers. The gun has got the very limited traverse, so you have to move the vehicle. That is all right when you're attacking, because you're moving forward and you can be seen. But if you're in a defensive position, the movement would actually show your position.
Another assault gun design that was used by the Germans during the Ardennes offensive was the Jagdpanzer IV Lang. This vehicle was based on the Panzer IV chassis and weighed around 26 tons. The crew contained 4 men. Its main armament was the very potent 75mm L70 main gun. This was the same gun that was used on the Panther. One MG42 machine gun provided the close quarter support. Armor protection was 80mm thick. Top speed was 24 miles an hour. This vehicle had a low silhouette, and together with the very effective main gun made this machine a very capable killer. These new tank designs joined the existing German machines, including the Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger. On the whole, the German tanks were probably superior to the Allies, who still relied on the Sherman.
Well, here is the only other tank in the world which equaled the production figures of the T-34, and that's the American Sherman. Again, about 45,000 were built at different marks, just like the Russian, and it was all around a very good tank, but its success is mainly because of the quantity it was produced in. The American enemies just couldn't match that sort of thing. These early Shermans were fitted with a 75mm gun, but not very long, as you can see, which means it hasn't got a high starting velocity of the shell. But it was changed later, and especially the latest Shermans in the end had the famous British 17-pounder, which was as good as the German 88, and places probably even better with a tungsten shell in it. On top, of course, you got a heavy machine gun as well. And otherwise, as are most tanks, the bow machine gun, here next to the driver, the coaxial one next to the gun, you see, sticking out there, and then a very heavy one on the top. And later on, as well, you had anti-aircraft machine guns for defense against low-flying aeroplanes.
The Ardennes offensive was given the codename Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. Hitler had envisaged a repeat of his great victory in the summer of 1940, which knocked France out of the war. But the situation in December 1944 was very different to May 1940. For one, the planned route for the new offensive cut straight across the Ardennes. In 1940, the route used had travelled in a southwesterly direction and utilised the road system that generally ran in that direction also.
The strike of the roads, the run of the roads, follows, of course, the valley bottoms, and the valley bottoms run southwesterly. However, the Germans wanted to strike, to get to Antwerp, northwesterly. So they were striking across the grain of the countryside, across the grain of the road system. That would mean difficulties when they were trying to plan a fast, mobile offensive using tanks.
The Ardennes is a very thickly forested area. The roads, certainly in 1944 and even today, are very narrow roads, very steep roads. There's lots of areas in which they can be ambushed. For example, on a very narrow road, one anti-tank gun knocks out the first tank, nothing can get past it. And this is one of the problems that the Germans faced.
Another restrictive feature of the planning was the lack of sufficient fuel.
By late 1944, the Germans were desperately short of fuel. All of their fuel came from the Romanian oil fields, which by that time were either in the hands of the Russians or were being overrun by the Russians. The only fuel that they could produce was synthetic fuel, which was produced from coal. And so part of the overall planning for the Ardennes offensive was that the German forces, the panzer forces in the advance, would capture and use American fuel stocks. As we know, the Americans actually destroyed those fuel stocks.
The fuel factor, on its own, was to play a significant part in the eventual failure of the operation. The deployment of the forces was not best suited to ensure success either. The advance towards Antwerp required the forces to swing northeast after the Germans had reached the Meuse River. Given that the Allies had strong forces in Belgium and Holland, it was suspected that they would eventually mount a counterattack into the German left flank. However, the strongest armoured German forces were situated on the right flank and too far removed to meet any potential threat. The Germans did have some elements in their favour.
In the Ardennes, the Americans had weak forces that were there for rest and recuperation, or there were units that had been badly mauled in the fighting and they were there it was a quiet part of the line, and that was another reason why the Germans attacked.
The other point is, of course, its unpleasant fighting conditions. This is December 1944. It's cold, rain, sleet, very difficult conditions for fighting in. The Germans, of course, were rather more accustomed to this given their experience on the Eastern Front, and so Hitler may well have thought that that was a gain for them. He was also, of course, hoping that the weather would keep the Allied air forces at bay.
The much-feared Yarbos, or rocket-firing planes, struck fear into the heart of every German soldier. The poor weather situation prevalent in the middle of December 1944 would keep the Allied planes on the ground for the vital opening phases of the attack. This would hopefully allow the advance to make a good start and reach some of the objectives. When the attack began, the scale of the German forces unleashed surprised the Allied commanders. Some of them had suspected a German attack around this time, but not to this extent. Some of the forces that were part of the German attack had been severely mauled during the Normandy battles. The planned area of attack was also being held by Allied troops who themselves had only recently been involved in heavy fighting around the Hürtgen forest. Hitler was confident of success and did not allow any alterations to his plans. By the 16th of December, everything was in place. The quiet Ardennes sector was about to erupt with the sound of battle. The panzers were once again moving west. The Germans had assembled an impressive lineup of tank forces for the offensive. The powerful 6th Panzer Army were positioned in the north under Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. This force included the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, 9th SS Hitler Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and the 12th SS Panzer Division. Their task was to advance along the route from their forming up area near Dahlem in Germany and into Belgium around the town of Lochheim. Their objective was to cross the Meuse River just below Liège and advance onto Antwerp. Just to the south of this force was the 5th Panzer Army under the command of Lieutenant General Hasso von Manteuffel. He had the 2nd Panzer, 9th Panzer, 116th Panzer and the Panzer Lehr divisions, together with the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Their objective was to move from Prüm in Germany and onto Antwerp via Brussels. The 7th Army, under General Erich Bradenberger, was to take the southernmost route into Luxembourg. This was the infantry-only formation made up from the 5th Infantry Divisions, including a better halved parachute division. They were to move from Bitburg in Germany and into the area held by the US 3rd Army with the objective of tying down these forces. All these forces were part of Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Model. They had very limited reserves in the shape of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the Führer Begleit Brigade and the Führer Grenadier Brigade. This total force had 2,000 artillery pieces, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and 250,000 men. To have assembled this impressive force after the destructive battles in Normandy and the East was an exceptional feat on its own.
Hitler recognized that the greatest factor that would operate to the German advantage would be surprise. No commanders were to travel with copies of the plan in their possession if they were going to go by air. There was to be no radio traffic concerning the plan. All communications were to be by hand, personally delivered, and if necessary, destroyed afterwards. Knowledge of the plan was kept on a very strict need-to-know basis. Then, as far as the movement of forces was concerned, movement was at night only in order to avoid Allied air reconnaissance. There were strict instructions about camouflage, so very strict precautions to achieve surprise.
The storm was about to break on just 4 infantry divisions, who were part of the US 5th Corps under Major General Gerau. 2 were positioned opposite the 6th Panzer Army. Facing Manteuffel in the center were the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, who were part of Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps. In the south, facing Brandenburger's men, were the 9th Armored and the 4th Infantry Divisions. All of these American units had recently been involved in heavy fighting and were in the area for a rest. They totaled around 80,000 men, less than 450 tanks and assault guns, and around 400 artillery pieces. Although initially outnumbered, the Allies had strong forces positioned close by, including Patton's Third Army, that could be called upon to back up the defenses in this area. On the morning of the 16th of December, the German artillery opened fire along the entire front line. The object of this was to confuse the enemy, disrupt their lines of communication, and open gaps in the lines. Due to the extreme secrecy beforehand, the Germans were unable to identify the Allied positions in advance. The result was that the German bombardment had limited success. It did sever Allied lines of communication, inflict some casualties, and provide some confusion, but not to the extent that was hoped for by the Germans. In the north, Dietrich's forces advanced towards Elsenborn Ridge. A German parachute drop had been ordered for this area, with the objective of capturing a vital road junction in the Baraque Michel. This drop did not go well, as the paras were scattered over a wide area. They found themselves in amongst the US 1st Infantry Division, so the small force had to fight its way back to their own lines. The failure of this small but significant action would help to delay the advance of the SS armor. Dietrich's men had Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper at their head. This SS officer was a seasoned veteran of Russia and Normandy. He had a battalion of 45 King Tigers under his command, but in the opening stages they were not with the lead force. He helped to ensure that the advance got off to a good start towards the Elsenborn Ridge under the cover of the bad weather. However, the Americans gave a good account of themselves and succeeded in preventing the Germans from taking this vital high ground. Slightly south of here, the main body of the 1st SS Panzer Division moved into the gap that had been opened up between the US 5th and 8th Corps. The route of their advance was towards Honsfield, which they reached on the following day. Various delays had taken place, but by the end of day 1, progress had been made. In the 5th Panzer Army's area, the advance got under a good start. They moved against the thinly spread American units and forced through the enemy positions. Some of the American forces slowed the advance and managed to hold some of the bridges in the area. By the end of day 1, however, crossings had been made over the Our River, and the German panzers rolled on towards Clairvaux. Further south, the 7th Army ran into similar difficulties to Dietrich. The ground was favorable to the defender, and Brandenburger's men made little headway.
Of confusion reigned for the first day or so, but after that the plan began to fall apart. partly because once the initial surprise was overcome, American soldiers stood and fought, and this slowed the German advance down, especially in key areas. The roads proved as difficult to negotiate as had been anticipated, slowed down again.
Overall, although difficulties had been encountered, the 17th of December would see the all-important armour committed in strength. However, the American High Command was starting to react to the German attack. Reinforcements were being rushed to the area to meet the threat. Among these reinforcements were the 7th and 10th Armoured Divisions, together with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. These last two units were ordered to the vital road junction of Bastogne. The German attempt to reach their objective continued. Dietrich in the north was keen to make progress. He moved the 12th SS Panzer Division from their attack on Elsenborn Ridge and pushed them in behind the 1st SS Panzer Division, who were moving towards the Amblève River. The move actually helped to relieve the pressure on the Americans defending the ridge area. This allowed them to catch their breath and set up a defense that the Germans could not breach. Dietrich had an ace up his sleeve in the shape of the 150th Panzer Brigade. This force was under the command of Otto Skorzeny, who is probably best known for his dramatic rescue of Mussolini.
But part of the deception plan, the Germans actually equipped Sikorsky's units with English-speaking Germans wearing American uniforms and driving American vehicles. The idea was to spread confusion amongst the American forces. These units would actually go ahead, capture the fuel supplies, and then the panzer units would refuel and continue their advance towards the Channel ports and towards Antwerp.
They were also to pass false information to the enemy and generally cause confusion. They did have some successes. The most notable was when they reached the Meuse. They were unable to capitalize on this success as the main body of troops were too far behind. Also, groups of them began to get stopped and arrested by the Americans. The rumors quickly spread that there were Germans driving around posing as friendly forces. Everyone became a suspect, and some very high-ranking American officers found themselves in awkward situations. Eisenhower himself was confined to his headquarters for fear of assassination. Although their objectives were not entirely reached, the psychological effect that this unit had was very widespread and out of proportion to the small numbers involved. Most of those that were captured were shot as spies. Piper's advance in the north had come across a group of Americans whom they took prisoner. They were held in a field near the crossroads at Malmedy. It was here that around 80 of them were shot. The Americans claimed that this was in cold blood. The Germans claimed that they were trying to escape. The bodies were found a short time later, and the search went out for the culprits. The story spread throughout the American lines and actually helped to instill resistance in the men. Just before this incident, Piper's men had succeeded in capturing a fuel dump at Bollingen. This had helped the advance to continue. They reached the bridge at Stavelot, but were held up for a number of hours when they came under attack. The advance into Stavelot did resume the following morning, and the town was captured. The advance continued towards Trois Ponts, close to here were the bridges that cross the Salm and Amblève rivers. These bridges were destroyed by the American defenders as Piper's men approached.
Germans got stopped. They got stopped by American anti-tank guns. People like Team Cherry was just one anti-tank gun on a corner, and a very narrow corner, or a very narrow bend with a railway bridge over the top. The Tiger tank came through under the bridge, got knocked out. That was that route blocked. They went another way, and the Americans blew up the bridges so they couldn't cross the river. The Amblev, for example, that stopped the offence. There was only 5 or 6 roads they could use. Well, as each road got blocked, the offence just petered out.
Piper was forced to move back towards La Glaise. He tried to advance through to Chenot, where another bridge crossed the Amblev, but came under attack from American planes. He decided to set up defenses around La Glaise and Stoumont. With the failure of this advance, the main emphasis was shifted to the 5th Panzer Army's sector. They were having better luck against the US 106th Division. However, the US 101st Airborne Division had reached Bastogne and set up all-around defenses. They offered such stiff resistance that Manteuffel ordered his forces to bypass the town and continue their advance. This created a bulge within a bulge and would provide a very prickly thorn in the German side.
The Germans couldn't take Bastogne principally because of the Allied generals' reactions. When the offensive began, within a matter of a day or so, Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, saw how the situation was developing, and he saw that places like Bastogne and a similar town called St. Vith were going to be crucial because they were road junctions. They commanded some key roads going through the fighting area. And so he sent, at great speed, a very experienced American division, the 101st Airborne Division, to occupy Bastogne.
On the 22nd of December, the Germans went to Bastogne with a white flag and the offer of surrender for the Americans. The garrison commander, General McAuliffe, offered his famous nuts reply. The vital town of Saint-Vith, further north, had fallen to the Germans on the same day. They had been battling around this town for days, and like in other areas, these delays allowed the Americans to build up defenses further back. On the 24th, Manteuffel's forces reached an area just west of Celle. This was to become the furthest point reached by the Germans during this offensive. Christmas Day, 1944, saw the besieged Bastogne coming under increasing pressure from the Germans. They pushed more and more forces into this area in an attempt to eliminate the pocket. Further south, elements of Patton's forces were moving closer, and on Boxing Day they managed to force an opening through the German lines and into Bastogne. This was the beginning of the end of Hitler's Ardennes offensive.
I think that probably the fundamental reason for failure was that Allied troops, American and British troops, after the first confusion and flight, stood their ground and fought. And it was essentially that blunted the Germans. Lots of small firefights where they imposed an hour's delay, 2 hours delay, 3 hours delay upon the attacking forces. This gave the Allied staffs time to move the reinforcements into place, which would ultimately seal off the blockage.
Another significant occurrence around this time was the improvement in the weather. This allowed the Allies to send sorties against the German positions.
Had the Germans enjoyed the same kind of logistical support and air supremacy that the Allies did, this might well have been a war winner. But as it was probably one of the worst kind of vehicles you can imagine to be in. The skies above it were completely dominated by Allied fighter bombers, and this presented a massive target that made it a lot easier for a fighter bomber to hit. And that was a frequent cause of destruction of these guys.
At L'Église, Piper could see the hopelessness of the situation. His men were receiving a pounding by American artillery and tanks. The Americans fired over 58,000 shells into this area during the battle. This provides a good picture of the punishing fire that Piper's men would have endured. He ordered that the tanks and half-tracks that had not already been destroyed by Allied fire to be destroyed by his own men to prevent their use by the enemy. They were out of vital fuel and ammunition. He left some of his men behind to give the impression that they were still battling, and also to look after the 150 American prisoners that they had captured. He took the remaining 800 survivors with him and made for German-held lines. Piper managed to reach these lines a few days later. The escape attempt had been dangerous, and on more than one occasion his men became involved in firefights with American forces that were moving across Piper's escape route. Piper not only left behind some of his men, he also left behind an impressive bag of irreplaceable armored vehicles that included 6 King Tigers, 13 Panthers, 6 Panzer IVs, and over 50 other vehicles, including around 45 armored half-tracks. These losses were hard to take at this stage of the war. Further south, the corridor into Bastogne was slowly widened. Ferocious battles took place around this area, and both sides fought desperately for control. The Americans pushed more and more forces into the Bastogne area. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans called the battle, was proving a very hard fight for both sides. As the Allies were able to push more forces into the area, they slowly succeeded in pushing the Germans back. By the 2nd of January 1945, the front line had been reduced by around 15 kilometers. Although the Ardennes offensive is always associated with American forces, the British forces also played a vital role. In the early stages of the offensive, Montgomery had recognized the importance of the River Meuse to the Germans and had placed strong British forces in a defensive position along the northern sector. He was also given command of some of the American forces. This in itself caused a rift between the Allies and in some respects almost helped Hitler to achieve his goal. When the time was right, Montgomery launched a counterattack into the German lines with the objective of linking with the Americans further south. This objective was finally reached on the 4th of January at the town of La Roche. What this meant was that a solid defensive line now existed that the Germans could not hope to penetrate. Also, the River Meuse, that was vital to German success, was now out of reach. Hitler still ordered the advance to continue and achieve the original objective, but at this stage this was an increasingly impossible task. The intensity of the battle is best described by Patton himself, who on the 6th of January expressed his very real fears that the war could still be lost by the Allies. The 1st SS Panzer Division were moved down to this area to help destroy the Americans at the end of December. This did nothing to change the final outcome and only added to the German casualty list. The Allied fighters flew sortie after sortie against the Germans and inflicted further aerial destruction on the increasingly pressurized German forces. The Luftwaffe launched their own attacks around the start of January, when around 1,000 planes flew against Allied targets. This attack had some notable successes, including the destruction of 300 Allied aircraft and the damage to around 25 Allied airfields. Around the middle of January, some of the German units were withdrawn, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. This put even more pressure on the remaining German forces. Hitler had also launched another, smaller offensive called Nordwind at the start of January. It had the objective of destroying the Allied positions around the Vosges Mountains. The attacks quickly bogged down against the Allied defenders, but fighting did continue until the middle of January. The operation itself achieved nothing of any significance, but it represented a high, irreplaceable cost to the Germans in men and machines.
The aftermath of the offensive was that the battlefield was covered with abandoned German tanks, left by the crews because they'd run out of fuel, either destroyed by the crews themselves or destroyed by Allied tanks or by Allied air power.
By the end of January, the front line was back to where it had been at the start of the German offensive 6 weeks earlier. The loss of the Ardennes offensive removed any reserves that the Germans possessed and that could have been used in the defense of the Reich. In the east, the Russians had launched their new offensive in January 1945. There was nothing available to counter this threat. Hitler's last gamble in the west had failed completely. The end of the Third Reich was in sight.